Okay, so what actually happens when a civilization's ideological immune system just completely shuts down? Let's dive right into this explainer where we're going to neutrally deconstruct Jean Raspail's 1973 novel, The Camp of the Saints. We're analyzing this strictly as a literary thought experiment about systemic failure. Now, the novel is highly provocative, for sure. But for our purposes today, we're focusing entirely on the mechanics of the narrative itself. Specifically, we're going to examine the profound psychological paralysis that the author suggests causes Western institutional failure. It's a really gripping look at how an ideological defense mechanism can fail, and we'll map out exactly how that collapse unfolds on the page.
To map this collapse out chronologically, we'll be covering first the dystopian thought experiment, then the Calcutta catalyst, followed by the incubation of psychological paralysis, the abdication of authority, and finally, the final dominoes fall. These 5 steps chart a society's complete descent into structural inertia.
Starting off with Part 1, the dystopian thought experiment, moving from warfare to paralysis.
To really grasp the premise here, we have to talk about this concept of suicidal empathy. The author uses this highly biased, omniscient narrator over in Switzerland, like a bird's-eye view, to mock what he sees as hollowed-out Western institutions. But here's the kicker. This isn't your standard military thriller with bullets, steel, and tactical maneuvers. No, it's a deep dive into ideological vulnerability. Imagine an invasion where literally not a single shot is fired. The text asks us to imagine a society where the will to survive is entirely replaced by, well, terminal guilt. This Ganges Armada, the massive fleet of refugees at the center of the story, doesn't win through kinetic warfare. It succeeds entirely because the target society is completely frozen by this profound psychological paralysis.
All right, moving to Part 2, the Calcutta catalyst, the spark of the Exodus. It's truly fascinating how a tiny, seemingly minor bureaucratic tremor acts as the ultimate catalyst for the whole thing. Basically, the cancellation of adoption visas serves as the final administrative slamming shut of the West's gates. And ironically, that exact paperwork decision triggers a massive, desperate surge. Out of this absolute chaos emerge characters referred to as the Turd Eater and his monster child, who basically become these messianic figures leading nearly 1 million people toward a promised Western paradise of milk and honey. It goes to show how a simple administrative block gets completely flattened by a radical power shift. I mean, you really can't stop a desperate mass of people with mere paperwork when the target institution itself has zero conviction left.
Which brings us to Part 3, Incubation of Psychological Paralysis, the 50-day voyage.
So as this armada of 100 completely dilapidated ships begins its really slow march toward Europe, the book uses this exact time frame to track the psychological regression of Western society. It's a 50-day incubation period, and the physical approach of this fleet acts as a massive pressure cooker for psychological collapse. You have Day 1, leaving Calcutta, Day 25, getting rejected at the Suez Canal, Day 40, the Isle of Naxos tragedy, right up to Day 50, which is the absolute climax of suicidal empathy. As these ships inch closer and closer, the target society's impending ideological collapse just goes into overdrive.
And the author sets up a really stark contrast here. While non-Western nations, like Egypt, for example, successfully assert hard sovereignty and just completely block the fleet's transit at the Suez Canal, Western nations are totally paralyzed. When a Greek freighter accidentally plows through the Armada near the Isle of Naxos on Day 40, killing thousands, the West doesn't process it as a tragic maritime accident. Instead, it becomes this profound moral indictment. They literally arrest the Greek captain, basically criminalizing their own defense mechanisms and destroying their own will to resist. In fact, the media in the novel brands this arrested captain with a very specific, heavily loaded phrase, the white race incarnate. By slapping this label on him, the media and religious institutions reframe the approaching Armada into the ultimate moral test. And, as the author sets it up, it's a test that these institutions believe can only be passed through total ideological surrender, essentially facilitating their own replacement. At this point, the psychological paralysis is 100% complete.
Now for Part 4, the abdication of authority, the administrative kill shot. This escalating narrative pressure forces a final, fatal decision from the French leadership. It reads like a step-by-step autopsy of how a hierarchical state just completely dissolves from the very top down. Step 1, preparation of strength. The president readies this hardline speech, ordering the military to hold a quarantine line at all costs. But then, Step 2 happens, the moral crack. Live on television, the crushing weight of institutionalized guilt and media pressure just shatters his resolve. Which leads directly to Step 3, the abdication of command, where he entirely abandons his role. And naturally, Step 4 follows, the complete evaporation of defense, as soldiers just walk away from their posts. And the specific trigger for that final evaporation? A devastating instruction from the commander-in-chief to his soldiers. He tells them, "Follow your own consciences." Think about the systems or organizations we all interact with daily. This phrase acts as a state-sanctioned opt-out. It instantly severs the chain of command. Freed from their duty by their own leader, the soldiers just abandon their posts, and that military quarantine line dissolves into thin air. It's a striking demonstration of how profound psychological paralysis can dismantle physical defenses in an absolute flash.
That brings us to our final section, Part 5, the final dominoes fall, the dual front and global capitulation.
So, with the political structure entirely gone, a massive pincer movement hits on Easter Monday, signaling the absolute end of the old order. Externally, this sudden cyclone acts as a catalyst, driving the grounded refugees inland, and they immediately take over luxury coastal infrastructure. We're talking villas, hotels, churches. Meanwhile, internally, existing immigrant populations in major industrial hubs like Paris and London launch coordinated uprisings to seize vital factories and communication centers. The state gets paralyzed from the outside and the inside at the exact same time, with absolutely zero resolve left to push back.
And this localized paralysis quickly sets off a global cascade of capitulation. The remnants of the old world are systematically erased by their own rebranded institutions. In this one medieval village, traditionalist holdouts, including main characters like Professor Calgues and Colonel Dragazes, are ironically bombed to smithereens by their own former government, which is now operating under the banner of the Paris multiracial commune. Over in New York City, a black tide climbs the skyscrapers, representing total urban collapse. In London, British sovereignty is formally handed over to a non-European committee. And eventually Switzerland, the very last bastion, just buckles under the international pressure. Ultimately, the epilogue reveals the absolute completion of this cultural transformation. The narrative frame formally closes right as Switzerland opens its borders. That single act permanently silences the biased narrator's vantage point. The civilization that originally launched the Armada has now entirely superseded the West, bringing this really grim thought experiment on systemic failure to its ultimate conclusion.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a pretty provocative question. By stripping away all the normal military aspects of an invasion and focusing entirely on psychological paralysis, the novel really forces us to ask, how do the moral narratives a society tells itself impact its actual structural ability to survive a crisis? Whatever you might think about the book's highly controversial politics, as a pure study in systemic resilience and psychological vulnerability, it leaves us questioning where the true foundations of a civilization actually lie. Is it in its walls, or is it in its will? Thanks so much for joining me for this deep dive.